مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. إن كانت هناك دولة واحدة في العالم تتلقى فيها مصالح أمريكا استراتيجية مع مخاوفها الإنسانية فهي سوريا. وإن كان هناك مكان واحد يرمز إلى تلك الحقيقة فهو مدينة حلب العريقة. طوال 5 سنوات تصارعت إدارة أوباما مع مشكلات سوريا، ولكن سوريا لم تنتظر البيت الأبيض. تحولت الاحتجاجات إلى ثورة، وتحولت الثورة إلى الحرب، وجلب النزاع الداخلي دولا أجنبية ومقاتلين أجانب. المشكلة التي صعب حلها قبل 5 سنوات صارت أسوأ بكثير اليوم، وقدرة أمريكا على التأثير على ذلك النزاع أكثر محدودية بكثير. في هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن سنناقش تحدي سوريا وأثاره على السياسة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية الخارجية إجمالا، مع اللجنة التي تضم خبيرين السياسيين نظرة وبيتر همفري. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. I'm sitting here with Juan Zarate and Peter Humphrey to discuss U.S. policy against ISIS and the battles raging in Syria and Iraq. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us this morning. So, recent news about a cessation of hostilities in Syria. Do you gentlemen think that this is going to last? Is the war over in Syria? Peter?
No way. The best we can hope for is that the peace lasts long enough that we can move enough supplies, medicines, food into villages that are suffering from starvation and medical crises, and that we can stockpile those towns and villages enough for when the inevitable collapse comes, that they'll actually have something there. To think that this is going to go on and that the pipeline can be maintained for months going forward, it seems totally unlikely.
Juan?
Rob, I think that's exactly right. I think that you also have the problem that the parties on the ground haven't all agreed to whatever ceasefire there may be, and there's deep interest on the part of all the warring parties to continue to change the shape of the battlefield and the territory that they control. You've seen this with the Assad regime, with Russian assistance marching toward Aleppo. The second problem is it appears that the Syrian regime, with Russian assistance, is gaming the diplomatic process a bit, giving themselves breathing room to take advantage of certain maneuvers, including the march toward Aleppo, to take advantage then of reshaping the battle space and the diplomatic environment. And so the peace talks, though hopeful in terms of helping on the humanitarian side short term, I don't think have any long-term prospects, at least at this point.
So let's take a step back for a minute. It's fairly clear what the strategy is for the Assad regime, for ISIS, even for the Russians. What is American strategy in this arena? Each of you. Peter?
A few things. The Obama administration desperately wants to avoid landing large numbers of American troops on the ground. And so it's quietly hoping for a couple of things. That there can be a détente with between the opposition forces and the government, and so at some point in the far future there might actually be united Syrian people who will then take out ISIS. That seems to me to be a grotesque fantasy. The second
grotesque fantasy.
Fantasy. The second possibility is that somebody assassinates Assad and al-Baghdadi, and I suspect that we are making an investment to try and remove to decapitate, as they say, the leadership in these two places, particularly on the ISIS front. America's laws do not allow us to take out a head of state, but the head of a terrorist group, that's fair game. So I have no doubt that there's a strategy at work to try and decapitate ISIS, hoping that that might result in change on the ground. But basically, the largest fantasy of all is thinking that ISIS can be swept up without some sort of major commitment of forces on the ground. Unlikely that would be a pure American-British force. More likely, it would be something reminiscent of Gulf War I, where the United States takes the lead and puts together a coalition of Arab and perhaps Turkish forces, maybe 6 countries putting in 5,000 soldiers apiece, and that's the force that takes out ISIS ultimately. But then, as with Gulf War I, you have to stop at some point. We had to stop at the Iraqi border because we didn't want to go on to Baghdad and take out Saddam Hussein. So if you did succeed in assembling a coalition army and it goes up, right up, and wipes out ISIS or pushes ISIS further west, where do you stop?
All right, so you've given us an idea of what U.S. strategy should be. We're going to get to that, which would, in your view, require a more significant investment of U.S. ground forces. What do you think American strategy really is at the moment, Juan?
Well, I think the reality, Rob, is that we don't have a clear strategy. And part of this is the schizophrenia and conflict of having, in some ways, a duality of policy goals in Syria. We started out with the support of the Syrian uprising, the peaceful uprising, and the call for the Assad regime to step aside, calling Assad illegitimate. That then gave way to the chaos of the civil war, the use of chemical weapons, the rise of ISIS, everything Peter's described so well. And then the real fear of the concern of what happens if there is a fall of the regime in Damascus, what comes next. And so what you've seen in American policy is this vacillation between what is really our policy goal in Syria, what is the end state, what comes after Assad. Is that the fall of Damascus and the rise of ISIS? What if we have not contained ISIS yet? We haven't taken back Raqqa, their capital. And so we're in a bit of a quandary, and I think the administration, unfortunately, has hoped that things would organically sort of resolve themselves. Either the uprising would take care of the regime or that the Syrian forces would be able to take care of ISIS. None of that has happened. And in fact, things have gotten more complicated with the introduction of Russian forces, more Iranian Hezbollah forces, and frankly, the worst humanitarian disaster in the 21st century. And so I think we're caught in a bind between not understanding actually what we are trying to achieve, which then leads to confusion, not just in Washington, but with our allies as well.
So you've both described confusion, fantasy, but yet Secretary of State Kerry is deeply engaged in trying to achieve some sort of peace settlement. What is the objective of his diplomacy, and does it bear any relation to what is happening on the ground?
Well, I think what he's trying to do is, frankly, all good diplomats try to do, is to take possible steps, baby steps toward a greater solution. And so in the short term, what you see is the attempt at a temporary ceasefire to then allow the humanitarian corridors and relief of those besieged cities, besieged by both the regime and terrorist forces, to try to then use that as a stepping stone for greater resolution of the conflict, a stasis of what's happening on the ground, and then potentially a political resolution to determine what happens in Damascus. The problem with this is that we're trying to do this in alignment with the Russians, and very much relying on the Russians to try to pressure the Assad regime, and to a certain extent the Iranians as well. But the Iranians and Russian interests are not aligned with ours, and their interests aren't necessarily to end the conflict as is or to create those steps toward a resolution. They want to empower the regime. They want to give it full advantage. And so if there is a ceasefire, the leverage and the power sits in Damascus and not with rebel or opposition forces or even in Washington. And so I commend Secretary Kerry for trying, and I think we have to do what we can on the humanitarian side, but to consider that the Russians or the Iranians are going to help with the long-term solution to the Assad regime, I think is folly and doesn't lead to a long-term solution.
So, Peter, what would it take for the peace talks actually to have a chance for success, in your view?
A clear ticket out for al-Assad to be retiring in Tehran or Belarus. A clear path of resigning his post. That's really the only way out. I'm intrigued by Russia's entry because of its motivations. Russia's motivations are to preserve its submarine base at Tartus, to be a significant geopolitical player after losing it all at the fall of the Soviet Union, to hopefully kill the many Russians who have joined ISIS rather than having them come back to Russia to cause trouble, and to preserve one of its best weapons clients in the al-Assad regime. So those are Russia's 4 motivations for keeping this thing going. It is something that at some point, if enough Russians die in the battles, at some point Russians will go, we're defending this idiot for what? Because Russia doesn't care about Alawi. It doesn't care about Shia. It doesn't really care about the person of al-Assad either. So those are Russia's motivations, and none of them have anything to do, have any parallel track with U.S. motivations. And in fact, they don't correlate all that well with Iranian motivations either.
So, Juan, it is clear that John Kerry is deeply invested in this, and it's not so apparent that the president is as deeply invested in this. You've worked in White Houses before. What happens in big diplomatic initiatives if there isn't clarity about the president's deep investment?
Well, at a certain point, the Secretary of State can do as much as possible, but at the end of the day, it's the president that sets the strategy, that commits resources, and that ultimately sends the ultimate political and diplomatic message on behalf of the U.S. government as to what the U.S. is willing to commit and risk. And so if that isn't clear, and if the messages, perhaps with body language as well as what the White House says it does publicly or privately, undermines what the Secretary of State is trying to achieve, then that ultimately undermines, obviously, the diplomatic path. But what happens in these cases, where the White House is unsure of itself, they're willing to allow the Secretary of State to venture forward to see if the Secretary of State can make some progress, can make some inroads, and then the White House will make a determination as to how vigorously to proceed. But I think the folly here is to think that we can resolve things from afar in meeting rooms in Vienna or Geneva, relying on Moscow to help broker, when at the end of the day what you have is still an active field of battle where the key players, including those allied with the U.S., are jockeying for position on the ground, and where all the major players realize that to affect the diplomatic end state, they have to affect the battle space first and foremost. And I think that is not yet clear in the mind of the White House as to what it means. And to Peter's earlier point, the White House has been deathly afraid and has tried to avoid the idea of American boots on the ground in any form or fashion, other than some spot special operations forces and activity in Syria. They do not want to be caught in a quagmire, and this president doesn't want to leave office having entered another war in the Middle East when he came into power, talking about the tides of war receding.
Okay, when we come back, we'll have to hold for just a second. When we come back, we're going to expand the conversation. We've been focusing solely on Syria. We're going to expand the conversation to the broader challenge of fighting ISIS and the enormous humanitarian challenge of refugees and how that fits into the strategic conflict that we see on the ground in just a moment. Again, my panel of foreign policy experts includes Juan Zarate. Juan is a senior advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the senior national security consultant and analyst for CBS News. One of our nation's leading counterterrorism and national security experts, he served in the George W. Bush administration as assistant to the president and deputy national security advisor. An attorney by training, he was the first ever Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for terrorist financing and financial crimes. His experience is the subject of the still fresh and still excellent book titled Treasury's War, The Unleashing of a New Era of Financial Warfare. Sitting to his right is Peter Humphrey. Peter is a former diplomat, foreign affairs professor, and frequent intelligence analyst. Once a marine geophysicist, he served in the Foreign Service in Mexico City and Rome, then pivoted to serve as a State Department analyst for Iraq and Iran. He subsequently taught at the Pentagon's National Defense University while undertaking research at the Institute for National Strategic Studies. An expert on Middle Eastern, Russian, and Korean issues, he writes regularly on intelligence and international affairs. So, gentlemen, let's broaden the aperture a bit. Peter, the fight against ISIS, are we doing well?
Clearly, the U.S. strategy is to push ISIS out of Iraq first. That's step one, while dropping some bombs on ISIS territory in Syria. I have to ask the question is, what happens when you get 10, 15, 20,000 ISIS guys booted out of Iraq if you actually succeed in doing so? And ISIS now finds itself with less territory, but a much bigger manpower force in Syria. What do they do next with that massive manpower? Do they strike out at the Russian bases? Do they strike out more at Al-Assad? Or do a lot of people end up going back home to their home countries, bringing their terrorism training with it?
Mm-hmm. All right, well, Juan, let me ask you, let me phrase the question slightly differently. American officials say that we've been squeezing ISIS territory and that their territory has shrunk, as Peter just pointed out. At the same time, we see that ISIS can undertake operations all over the world, connected all the way to Los Angeles and Libya for sure. So who's doing better, us or them?
It's a great question. The problem and challenge is the analysis of what ISIS was 3 years ago is not the analysis of what ISIS is today, because the problem of ISIS just doesn't sit in Iraq and Syria anymore. It now sits in the spread of the movement, the raising of its banner in places like Libya, which is now of great concern to the U.S. and Western Europe, given the safe havens that they're establishing, the alliance with Boko Haram in Nigeria, establishment of 2,000 to 3,000 fighters in Afghanistan, a Caucasus province that they've established. They've officially established 8 provinces globally. And to your point, Rob, have demonstrated an ability to actually place fighters in the heart of a Western city, a Western capital like Paris, and execute a fairly significant series of attacks. And so the problem of ISIS isn't just about territory they control in Iraq, though that's critical. It's now a global problem. What's interesting here, Rob, is as you've heard the Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, talk about this problem. Several months ago, he talked about the 3 prongs of American focus: Raqqa, Ramadi, and raids. And you've seen evidence of that. Ramadi has been taken back. Some territory has been regained. U.S. forces have been more engaged with Kurdish forces and the Iraqi forces. So that's positive. The problem is you still have Raqqa, the capital of ISIS in Syria. You have ISIS still growing some of its territory in Syria. And you have it still controlling Mosul. And so just in recent days, you had the Secretary of Defense talking about now the focus being on Mosul and Raqqa. The challenge there, of course, is these are hard challenges in a heavily civilian populated territory to dislodge ISIS, and then to worry about what happens even beyond Iraq. And I think what we have seen is a metastasizing of the ISIS problem, and a problem that's going to be with us for generations to come. And I think most counterterrorism experts at this point worry not just about the current manifestation of what ISIS or Daesh looks like, but potentially even what they are inspiring and adapting toward, and what the son of Daesh potentially looks like on a global basis.
So we only have less than a minute left. A quick answer to a tough question: where do you think this problem is going to be left 11 months from now when President Obama leaves office? Juan, Peter, brief answers.
I think history and current reflection will note that the president leaves office with a terrorist problem that is much worse than what he entered office with. He will face, and you'll look at the map, a terrorist archipelago of territory and safe havens and even urban environments held by terrorist groups, to include Mosul. And if you think about it, to say that a terrorist group of the most barbaric type that has executed attacks against the West and has global ambitions still will hold the second largest city in Iraq, probably 3 years after it's taken it, is almost unimaginable. But that's what the reality will be when President Obama leaves office.
Absolutely concur with that. The best we can hope for is to shrink Daesh territory. but we're not shrinking the army itself. The Daesh army continues to grow, has no problem replacing troops lost in the field, and that army is at some point, even if it loses territory, is going to go back home. So you have to take on Daesh territory in Syria to end the problem. Otherwise, it metastasizes throughout the world.
And the motivation behind the group as well. The motivation of their success, their holding territory, the imaginings of the caliphate itself is motivating globally.
We need Islam to stand up and say, this is not Islam, and we're going to act against our fanatic fringe.
Okay, gentlemen, it sounds like the next president will have a lot on his hands day one. Thank you very much, or her hands. Thank you very much for joining us here on Dakhel, Washington.
Thank you, Rob.
Thanks.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول السجل الأمريكي بشأن اتخاذ إجراءات من عدمه في سوريا، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@alhurra.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.